You'll very likely recall that Pastor Artur garnered the ire of authorities for daring to carry on as a pastor throughout COVID-19 restrictions, continuing to open his church and welcome all. He was targeted and saw selective enforcement according to just about everyone except the politicians that were overseeing it, and faced extensive incarceration, more than 50 days behind bars, as well as these troubling Soviet-style sanctions with limitations on his capacity to travel outside of Alberta, and even compelled speech provisions. This was extremely troubling, and thanks to your donations at saveartur.com, this ruling was challenged, and today we received a great victory in the Alberta Court of Appeal, overruling Justice Adam Germain's troubling ruling and securing a small victory for freedom and the Pawlowskis in Alberta.
One of it. We are providing necessities of life to those that you and your bosses refuse to provide.
The hope would be that this is the end of the story as the conversation unfolds and other courts react to this decision, right?
In an ideal world, that would absolutely be the outcome. I suspect that the Crown Prosecutor will not be waived on the Coutts protest charges. They're very keen to prosecute an individual on the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act. They are very keen to have a finding that that act is constitutional. They are very keen to use somebody like Artur Pawlowski as an example, I think, to say, don't attend protests. You don't have a right to protest. And you don't have a right to assemble or gather what the government would say if you look at the Beltline injunction at all. If you're going to disturb people while you protest, you can't protest, which really takes the meaning out of protesting.
And we have some incredible news today from the Alberta Court of Appeals on a couple stories, but particularly the story of Pastor Artur Pawlowski. We're going to get into all the nitty-gritty of those details with his lawyers, legal counsel, Sarah Miller of JSS Barristers now, to celebrate what is a hands-down victory for freedom and, in a way, a victory for the courts, showing that they are, in fact, starting to get some of these things right, and that this country isn't completely going down the drain quite yet. Sarah, thanks so much for joining me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks for having me.
So let's get right into it. Obviously, most people at home probably fairly aware with Pastor Artur Pawlowski's story, but he has been, I would argue, prosecuted and certainly persecuted for the past 2.5 years. But it really culminated with him spending 51 days in jail, also incurring the wrath of Justice Adam Germain with these troubling communist Soviet-style sanctions, which saw him unable to leave the province, as well as forced to read this compelled speech mandate, where he basically was spewing government talking points anytime he made a public opinion, rather than expressing his own opinions freely, as one might expect a Canadian citizen would be free to do. All of this extending, according to this appeal ruling, effectively from orders that never applied to him in the first place. So all for naught. What we've been saying all along, what you've been saying all along, has effectively been justified and proven accurate. So just break down, I guess, from your perspective, how big a win this is.
To me, this is huge for a number of reasons, and you've kind of touched on them, Adam. The first one is that the court came to this without a vindictive feeling about Artur Pawlowski. They go in and they say, they start off with their analysis with, look, we're not saying you don't need to comply with court orders. Of course you have to comply with court orders. That is, priority number one. But what we are saying is, if you, as Alberta Health Services or any applicant, go into court and get a court order, it needs to be clear and as to what it applies to and who it applies to. And Alberta Health Services went into court, didn't talk about Artur Pawlowski, didn't talk about David Pawlowski, didn't talk about church services, and asked for an order that constrained people who are doing activities in Central Alberta. The No More Lockdowns rodeo in particular. And so they then applied it to the Pawlowskis who are in Calgary, many hours away, have nothing to do with the No More Lockdowns rodeo, don't even know the people running it, and say, well, you know what we're going to do? We're going to arrest you. We're going to attend your church, serve David only, not tell him he's been served with, not give him any notice in advance, even though we've been sitting on this order for 2 days. Then we're going to arrest and detain you for 3 days for no particular purpose whatsoever. And then to prosecute them for the course of 6 months, bring multiple witnesses into the court proceedings. It's been a wild ride. And so for all of that to happen when it should have never occurred was very concerning. Last fall, I was very concerned about the state of our justice system. Today, the Court of Appeal has certainly remedied that to a certain extent by saying, you know what, this is not proper law, and we are going to follow the rule of law and approach this in a very rational and reasoned way.
You know, you're absolutely right. If with this massive ordeal, these massive legal fees, again, worth noting, a massive thank you to everyone at home who donated tax receipt eligible donations to the Democracy Fund at saveartur.com, made this battle possible. But you're right, this is a battle that should not have happened in the first place. Any objective outlook on this, you and I have spoken about this several times, that at face value, prima facie, this doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Why are we proceeding is a question we asked several times. So it is a bit bittersweet. We do have this victory, but it seems like a victory in a battle that should never have been fought. I was just speaking with Ezra, as were you, on the live stream regarding this particular issue. How subject, or how much potential is there for the courts to sort of descend into that again? Or do you think that this is very likely precedent setting as far as how the courts can respond to these types of instances moving forward?
My hope, of course, I don't have an ability to be able to, a crystal ball or an ability to see the future, but my hope is that we have a decision like what the JCCF got on the freedom marches. I hope that we repeat that with Artur Pawlowski. We're going to have that trial in December. We have this Court of Appeal decision now. It is my hope that going forward with the pain and fear of the pandemic behind us, and as we get more and more space from that fear motivated decision making, that the courts and the prosecutors and Alberta Health Services will all approach these issues with a little bit more clear thought, a little bit more, maybe a little bit of splashing cold water on their face before they launch into these types of things. So my hope is that we are moving in a direction of rational thought, rule of law. As the Court of Appeal said, you can absolutely get court orders that restrain people and even impact their constitutional liberties, but those orders must be specific, they must be clear, they must be processed in the right way. And the injunction order, which everybody called the Beltline order in Calgary, that applied to all of Calgary, was very concerning to me when I saw that order issued. I thought the police and the government actors in power are not learning their lessons. I'm hoping that the Court of Appeal decision now has indicated to them that this is not the proper way to proceed against individuals. You can't get writ large, overly broad, overly vague orders that suit the whim of the police or the enforcing agent.
Now, we're talking about this, obviously a massive legal victory. Everyone looking at this is going to acknowledge you've done some absolutely incredible work on this. The vast majority of the sort of serious sanctions against Pastor Artur Pawlowski basically erased. But this isn't off scot-free. This is a man who spent 51 days in jail in one term. He's been arrested several times, often in dramatic roadside arrest. What, from your perspective, is the route moving forward? Are there other legal issues that need to be addressed? What legal matters were completely set aside and resolved? What's the legal landscape for Pastor Artur Pawlowski right now?
So as of November 1st, 2021, Artur Pawlowski and his brother David Pawlowski were subject to a severe sanction, according to Justice Germain, which included not leaving the province, paying huge amounts of fines, paying legal costs to Alberta Health Services, and being under a probation order. The probation order itself has attracted criminal charges for breach of probation for them attending peaceful protests. So on January 1st, they attended a peaceful protest outside of Minister Copping's house. That attendance has triggered criminal charges because of a probation that should have not been enforced. After the sanction decision came out by Justice Germain, which was released June 30th of 2021, in that summer, the following months, there was a warrant issued for Artur's arrest for criminal proceedings. Once the Crown saw, yes, Justice Germain found this sanction or this contempt finding, and this is going in our direction, they filed charges. And because he was out of country, they couldn't charge him. So they issued an arrest for criminal contempt proceedings. Those are still outstanding as of today. So we've got criminal liability hanging over both David and Artur Pawlowski, all associated to this Justice Germain decision and the proceedings brought by Alberta Health Services. We hope in the coming days that the Crown Prosecutor will bring those matters forward and withdraw them. We don't know what their position will be on that yet. We have not reached out to them, but we hope that that will be the outcome of those. But as you mentioned, Artur Pawlowski has also spent 50 some odd days in custody. He's been targeted by police in other matters. And so he attends the Coutts protest. He's a target, at that point. He's well known to police. He's, there's been some not favorable findings to him lately in the courts, and they go, okay, well, we're going to get you on that too. So, and part of the reason he was arrested and detained at the Coutts protest is because he's got this probation. He's on release already. And so then it puts the burden on us to try and get him out rather than putting the burden on the Crown to try and keep him in. So usually your first criminal charge, it's on the Crown. As a Crown prosecutor, I have to discharge to the court why this person needs to be detained. When it's multiple criminal proceedings that have been outstanding, then the burden shifts to defense. So even though the Coutts protest is arguably separate from all of this Germain proceeding, right? It doesn't tie in tightly to it. It was impacted. Those whole proceedings were impacted by this Justice Germain decision. And we ended up with Artur Pawlowski in custody for 50 some odd days because of that, right? Because that burden was shifted. And because the court at first instance said, look, he's not listening to anything. And the reality is that he was, and the government, Alberta Health Services, and had misdirected the order, and Justice Germain had misfound a contempt finding, made a wrong decision. So, when we're getting a first hearing at release saying, oh, well, he's shown himself not to be listening to court orders, well, that's simply not true. The outstanding charges shouldn't have been laid in the first place. And there's issues with all those outstanding charges, in addition to the fact that, Justice Germain's decision has been overturned.
So very much there's a compounding, everything extended from this initial thing that's now been appealed. And so common sense would dictate, similar, like we've been saying, why is this proceeding all along? And we've been proven right, seemingly every step of the way. One would certainly hope that these officials who still have criminal proceedings or whatever else would be like, well, this is based on something the Court of Appeals has already ruled doesn't apply. And therefore the hope based on common sense, which necessarily hasn't been practiced by AHS and criminal proceedings across the board, but the hope would be that beyond what's already been served by Pastor Artur Pawlowski, and there's questions whether he seeks remuneration after that, but that's a separate conversation altogether. The hope would be that this is the end of the story as the conversation unfolds and other courts react to this decision, right?
In an ideal world, that would absolutely be the outcome. I suspect that the Crown Prosecutor will not be waived on the Coutts protest charges. They're very keen to prosecute an individual on the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act. They are very keen to have a finding that act is constitutional. They are very keen to use somebody like Artur Pawlowski as an example, I think, to say, don't attend protests. You don't have a right to protest. and you don't have a right to assemble or gather in, well, what the government would say if you look at the Beltline injunction at all. If you're going to disturb people while you protest, you can't protest, which really takes the meaning out
Defeats
of
the purpose of
protesting.
protesting. Now, forgive me, I'm not a lawyer, but doesn't it seem problematic to set precedent on an extremely complicated case that is largely lost in appeals, and to use that as a basis if you're trying to set an example? There's been literal attacks on pipelines and other examples that have taken place. That seems disjointed.
I think from the perspective of the Crown, and of course I'm speculating here, nobody has said this to me. I can't, it would be unusual for them to tell me what their strategy is, but from their perspective, Artur Pawlowski is not somebody who is sympathetic. So you get somebody in place who's 20, 21, a UBC student, taking environmental science, really passionate, but young, and, doesn't necessarily have the right filter or understanding as to legal consequences.
Right.
That person's going to be sympathetic, and
Right.
the courts are going to treat it as sympathetic. Artur Pawlowski, from the court's perspective, is not a sympathetic defendant. That the courts will not go easy on him because of who he is. That he generally, has an idea that if the police show up, there's some sort of liability associated to it, and he knows this because he's been arrested, multiple times before. I suspect that is part of the reason why they're interested in proceeding with respect to him.
Well, for the courts, they may not deem Pastor Artur Pawlowski as sympathetic, but a survivor of communism who escaped Poland, came here as a pastor, and is preaching his message despite the consequences. The whole world has been paying attention, watching your legal efforts, certainly contributing at saveartur.com, which I encourage you to continue doing. Artur is not a man to be made an example of. He's made that clear, especially with your stellar legal efforts with your team at JSS Barristers. So we're going to keep following this story. We're not giving up. We know this isn't done until this man is completely free and walking the streets, not burdened by these restrictions, free to preach, free to care for the homeless population here in Calgary, to do all these incredible things he's been doing for so many years. And again, I want to extend our heartfelt thanks to you. We've obviously been covering this story for 2.5 years. As soon as I started, I was on board. This was one of the first stories I got to go right into the deep end on. But you've been there the whole time as well. You've been following it. You've been serving as legal counsel in Pastor Artur's corner. And I think if he didn't have someone like you with your exceptional sort of legal mind and your tireless work efforts, we might be looking at a different story. So Sarah Miller, thank you so very much. For those at home who want to see Sarah continue to work for Pastor Artur, please consider making a tax receipt eligible donation to the Democracy Fund at saveartur.com. And as always, I want to thank you all so much for tuning in. For Rebel News, I'm Adam Soos.
So once again, I do want to just encourage you. We do have some significant victories here, but there are still hundreds of cases out there that are depending on your donations. So go to fightthefines.com now. Any contribution that you make goes to the Democracy Fund, so they are eligible for a tax receipt, and they go a long way to keeping people like Chad Williamson and his team hard at work fighting for freedom. Again, go to fightthefines.com.